It's my pleasure to welcome you to a panel discussion this evening with the Hertog Global Strategy Seminar. This is a session we're running this summer with the patronage of Roger Hertog and the Hertog Foundation. I want to acknowledge that. And also under the directorship of Matt Conley, professor of history here at Columbia. So we're going through discussions about the history of climate change, its relationship to global governance, and there's things like climate science involved as well. So under that very narrow definition of a field, which is extremely broad, I'm going to ask the panelists to respond to us a couple prompts just to get us going, but they're certainly not shy, and they're from all different disciplines. And we're going to proceed with a conversation amongst the panelists, and then a session after their responses from the audience. So there'll be questions as well, plenty of time for that as we proceed. And I want to introduce the panelists to you very briefly. I think their biographies are in the little brochure that you have or could have received when you came in. The panelists are Deborah Cohn, who's a professor of history here at Barnard College. And she is a historical thinker who works primarily in the 19th century and the turn of the 20th century, and looks at interesting issues in Central European history, as well as in the history then of what we might call meteorology and now seismology. She has a new book called The Earthquake Observers, Disaster Science from Lisbon to Richter. On her left is Paul Edwards, professor of School of Information, otherwise known as SI, in the Department of History at the University of Michigan. And so Paul has come quite a distance to be with us. He's an interdisciplinary scholar who has written basically the book on the history of climate modeling. The Vast Machine book is very well received. He does many, many other things, but he is coming off a sabbatical or a leave of absence where he's been teaching in Paris and now sharing his perspectives with us tonight. On his left is Michael Levy, who is the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations. And he basically was telling me that he can has a tremendous intellectual freedom to do almost anything he wants to do. So what he likes to do is study the domestic history of energy policy, especially around the issue of fracking and natural gas issues. Was I allowed to say that, Dave? Michael?
Joe.
And so he's come from in town to share. He's a veteran of this program because the Hertog Foundation has funded 4 cycles of this on different issues, and this year happens to be on climate change. Next to Michael is Gavin Schmidt, and Gavin comes again from across town on a climatologist and climate modeler at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Sciences. And he works on building giant climate models and training us all into his worldview through the Borg, right? He's written a wonderful book together with Joshua Wolf, which I've used productively in my work. It's a very accessible book called Climate Change, Picturing the Science, and it's highly illustrated and very well argued book. And so he also runs the Real Climate blog. So if you see him looking down at his palm, he'll be blogging this as we speak. And you'll see your question show up on the net. Last but not least is Mike Hume, who is the professor of climate change at the School of Environmental Sciences, University of East Anglia. And he's come to us as the founding director of the British Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. He's led the European Union integrated project ADAM on adaptation and mitigation strategies. He needs to leave here relatively quickly to go to Hoboken for the Wiley WIRES meeting that he runs a very prominent journal called WIRES Climate Change. And every one of the panelists is extremely multidisciplinary, multi-talented, and we're very glad to have them with us. They have different perspectives on this incredibly large field that we're defining or trying to define called history, climate, and global governance. And so I want to ask them to, in a way, begin to interact, hopefully with sparks flying or with disciplinary differences coming to the fore, about how they came into the field and what their perspective is on, especially the tensions and the differences in these various facets of something that we're trying to define as a convergent field of climate and governance. So in no particular order, but Deborah, you have the earliest perspectives, I would say, and so would you like to lead us off, and then there's no order after that.
Sure. So can you hear me? So how I came to the field. Jim, I cannot talk about how I came to the field of the history of climate science without insisting that you say something about the origins of this field, because you really are the origins. We really owe it all to you. I'll count on that. But I started out as a physics student, and when I got into the history of science, I was particularly interested in how scientists deal with uncertainty. All the resources they use, from statistics to psychological resources, family structures, social structures, ethical resources. And as a physics student, my mind was initially drawn to the fields of quantum mechanics and statistical physics, and so you come, upon naturally as an undergrad. And honestly, I found the earth sciences really boring at that point in my career, and I just kind of happened on the history of meteorology and discovered that actually meteorology, atmospheric science, in itself is fascinating to me. Gavin, I hope you appreciate that.
No, I do. I find it quite fascinating myself.
And that actually, the problems of uncertainty in this field, because of the nature of the physical systems, and even more today because of the political situation, are really far more compelling than anything I had ever thought about in the history of quantum mechanics. As far as where I see the field going, I think that we began writing the history of meteorology and climatology in a rather narrow sense, the history of the science of global warming, what scientists did in their observatories and their calculations. And now we've really expanded out to think about science, the science of climate, as part of culture from really the ancient world to today. Across the globe, not just in the U.S. Much of the research is still focused on the U.S., but we're learning more and more about what was going on in Europe and what's gone on in colonial encounters. So I'm very excited to see that cultural context coming to the fore.
You're so fast. I'm not sure I could be that fast, but so I'm also older, so I get to go longer. So my story begins with my first book, which I started as a dissertation when I was in graduate school, and it was about the history of computers in the United States during the Cold War. So that story is about the invention of computers and then their use in the construction of a kind of global command and control and surveillance system that is in full swing today with drone warfare, and it began in the 1940s. So I got into the climate subject, like a lot of other people, around 1988 when it first really became a public issue. And of course, that 1988 and 1989 were important years because the Cold War, we didn't know this in 1988, but in 1989, the Cold War came to an end very suddenly. And one of the things that was on the agenda to replace nuclear holocaust was global warming. Due in large part to Gavin's colleague, Jim Hansen, who testified in Congress in 1988 that he was 98 or 99% certain that it was happening and happening soon. Anyway, I went to a seminar about nuclear proliferation in the summer of 1988. One of the people who was there was Steve Schneider, who was a great climate scientist, died a couple of years ago. And he came to this seminar and he gave a talk about nuclear winter. We were all very worried about nuclear winter in 1988. That was the idea that you could basically repeat the experience of the dinosaurs with a nuclear war, blast the whole planet full of smoke and dust from the fires and the explosions of nuclear weapons, and darken the sky for months, and hence reduce the temperature to below freezing for many months, destroying crops and possibly ending photosynthesis and creating a global ecological catastrophe. So there was another apocalyptic scenario that was on the agenda. And I got interested in the history of that idea, and that led me into a study of climate modeling, because the nuclear winter studies were studies with climate models. And Steve, by the way, was on the side not of nuclear winter, but of nuclear fall. He never put that phrase in print, but when he talked privately, he would say, it really isn't going to be like a winter, it's going to be more like autumn. I just want to say one or two more things about this. That it turns out that there are a lot of very important and interesting connections between these two stories, the one about the global command and surveillance system built for the Cold War and climate modeling. And they exist in the form of people. So John von Neumann, one of the major developers of early computers, there was a computer named after him called the Johnniac. He worked on the earliest computers, and very soon after World War II began casting about for a problem to solve with computers that everybody would care about. And that problem turned out to be weather forecasting. And so the laboratory that he helped start at Princeton became the first laboratory to build a general circulation model of climate later on, after he died in the 1950s. The other person is Jay Forrester, who was really the principal architect of the air defense system for the continental United States, especially the computer part of that. And after he finished that project, he went on to do system dynamics modeling at MIT and produced a series of books that went from industrial dynamics to urban dynamics to world dynamics. And those were based on computer models of how population and pollution and the industry and agriculture and so on all interact. And the heritage of that modeling effort is now what we call integrated assessment models. So I'll stop there.
So I came early on out of the physics world. I left undergraduate, went to graduate school in physics, assumed that I would be a professor of theoretical physics doing string theory for the rest of my life. Figured out fairly quickly that I didn't find that all that interesting. And at the same time had my first exposure to other students at university who had been actually playing in the policy world rather than only talking about and complaining about political decisions at the dinner table. And so I moved to Washington and quite quickly got drawn in deeply into the policy world, first working on nuclear security issues. So one of the other connections between these different areas is there are a couple places where people who come from technical backgrounds, and particularly physics backgrounds, end up in the policy world. One of those is nuclear security, another of those is energy. And so I started and I spent 6 years or so working on nuclear issues. That was how I ended up being part of the previous Hertog summer. And at some point decided I wanted to do more than just nuclear issues. I was living in New York rather than DC, and I wanted something where being in New York gave me an edge rather than a disadvantage, so I thought something with an economic connection would be interesting. And so I started spending time working on climate change. What I find fascinating about it, and what's kept me in it, is that it allows me to avoid deciding what I want to be when I grow up. If you're working on climate policy, and if you're working on it in a smart way, you think about science, you think about technology, you think about economics, about global governance, about local communities, you think about finance, you think about engineering, you think about pretty much anything that you want to if you're doing it in a smart way. And so I find it endlessly fascinating that way. In the last several years, I've built out a bit from climate to look more broadly at energy systems, with climate as one of several influences on energy systems and and areas that sets goals, along with economics and security and community impacts that we need to think about when we look at energy systems. I find it interesting for a couple of reasons. One is it allows you to look at tensions between different objectives, and I think you learn a lot of the most interesting things about policy and about the underlying issues when you look at tensions. It forces you to be sharp. And also these tensions, these seams between different areas, between economics and climate and security, tend to be, unfortunately, the most intellectually untouched, because they require that you get, at least to do them well, that you get smart about multiple areas. And most people, unfortunately, don't want to spend too much time getting smart about multiple areas. They want to dive down into their little corner. All the better for me, because I think it means that there's more interesting territory left over to think about.
I started off as a mathematician, just because that was something I was very good at. And I didn't really think about my career at all. Though I do remember when they made you do one of those aptitude tests, like when I was like 13, and I ticked all the boxes, and it actually told me that I would be a theoretical physicist, and failing that, an actuary. So I got pretty close to theoretical physicist. I decided to do a PhD pretty much on a whim. The person that I went to talk to, who had some money, said, well, we're going to do some ocean-related stuff. And I said, oh, wait, that sounds good. Let's do that. And then I had this like kind of this epiphany, because, you know, my entire youth up until then, people would ask me what I was studying, what I was doing, and I would say, oh, you know, I'm a mathematician. And I don't know if any of you have ever tried that at a party. Not a great move. But now I was doing ocean stuff, and so I said, well, you know, I'm doing ocean stuff. And they said, oh, you mean like whales and like, you know, sharks and penguins and things? I said, no. At which point it kind of regressed back to the same thing. I was going, oh, this is interesting. So when I did I finished doing the ocean stuff, which wasn't very oceany, and it was actually more mathematics than it was ocean. And it turned out that 4 people in the world really cared what my PhD was. I was looking desperately for a job, and again, just completely randomly, somebody said, well, I'll give you a job, but you can't do any of that ocean stuff. We're going to do some climate things. And I'm going, okay, that sounds great. And I put the phone down, and I'm going, what's this climate stuff? What is that? At which point I found out that doing climate stuff really gets you into very interesting conversations at parties, far more so than you might imagine. And ever since then, you know, I've kind of been driven by my desire to be popular at parties, to do more and more integrated things that actually matter for the real world, and to do modeling that's more and more realistic as best as we can and manage it. To the point where I was sitting in a bar in just around the road at one point, and this woman turned to me and said, "Do you know the composition of air?" And just kind of out of the blue, and I said, "Yes, nitrogen and oxygen, and you know." And she said, "Oh, rats!" And she turned back to the person she was having a conversation with, and she'd been trying to demonstrate that nobody knew anything, and how appalling educational standards were. And that threw her so much for a loop. She ended up marrying me. So the point being that, you know, do what is interesting to you, that you know, people like talking to you about at parties, because it will get you on a panel like this. I have more interesting things to say about actual climate, but I just thought I'd share that with you.
So my encounter with climate change was back in the early 1980s, when climate change probably meant something a little different to what it means to most of us today, most of us in this room at least, because I studied the effects of rainfall variability on water resources in Sudan, in Northeast Africa, at a time when that region of Africa was going through extended drought, leading a number of times to tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people dying. Lack of food, lack of water. So my experience with climate change was, as a geography student doing my PhD, was that climate really does matter for society. And I think that experience of the significance of climate change, and as I said at the time in the 1980s, early 1980s, climate change didn't have the same pejorative sense that it does today. It doesn't sort of provoke maybe the sort of conversations that Gavin encounters at his parties now than it did 30 years ago. But it did impress upon me the great social significance of climate for human welfare and well-being. Over the 30 years of my career, I've studied climate change in lots of different settings, in lots of different ways, by analysing empirical data, a lot of work on global data sets, trends, using climate models in ways to develop scenarios, more recently in running an interdisciplinary centre to bring together different disciplines to try to make sense of climate change and to compose useful knowledge for society. But then in the last handful of years, 5 or 6 years, a slightly different change again is to get much more interested in the different ways in which human cultures interact with this idea of climate change. And it seems to me that climate change is now as much an idea that engages in the full range of human cultural pursuits and imagination as it is a physical phenomenon that can be measured with instruments or simulated by models. And it's that interaction between climate change as an idea and human cultures that I'm particularly interested in at the moment and will be taking forward in my future work.
I'm going to take a prerogative to say what I'm hearing is that climate matters, and it matters to all of you in very particular ways. But you've each followed your passions, and so you found your way, literally followed your passions, Gavin. But whether it's this concern for refuge, for disaster regions, for the Cold War, it comes back to culture. And so there is, I'm thinking there is something, or else I wouldn't be here. There's something that brings together this cultural turn and the scientific conversation. So it's this issue of climate matters, and it matters in a big way and in very particular ways. But I'd like to probe a little further and get you guys a little revved up about how you disagree with each other. So I'd really like to have quick and random statements about how you have completely different perspectives on the field, and whether it's actually a field at all, other than we're all on planet Earth in the 21st century.
Good, Deborah.
Yeah, okay, quick and random. I'll throw something out. So I think there were several moments in the course of our conversations today at our workshop when Gavin suggested that it just doesn't matter what anyone but the scientists think about the science, right? It's just not relevant.
Whoa,
and so
I didn't say that.
guess, that's something that we should take up. Right?
So obviously my communication skills are failing me a little bit, because I'm pretty sure that's not what I said. But we were discussing an issue about, cultures have different knowledge bases. They have somewhat different ways of knowing things. And we were talking about a particular case involving the Inuits, where there's a story that was in a movie where they were talking to the elders in this community, and they were talking about the changes that those elders had seen over their lifetime, and this is in Nunavut. They have seen enormous changes in their environment, mainly because it's been getting warmer, the sea ice has been changing, there's been changes to migration patterns, plus all the changes associated with being dragged into the modern world. And one of the things that they said was, well, on top of all those things, the sun, is not rising in the same place anymore. It's now rising over there, but it used to be over there. And it's very hard to understand how that could be a true physical thing, right? Because the Earth does not shift on its axis in large enough a way for that to have been a real thing without causing like some huge disruption in the rest of the planet. So we were talking about this kind of slight clash between ways of knowing. Right? These people know this, and I was under the impression that the point that was being made was that scientists need to pay attention to that to do science. And the point that I was making was that no, they don't, because the Earth did not wobble on its axis to such a degree, and nobody's going to change their model of orbital mechanics to deal with this anecdote from this other way of knowing. Now, that wasn't quite the same as saying that nobody else's opinion about what to do about climate or what to think about climate or how to engage with climate should be not taken into account, because obviously, as we said, as you said very clearly, climate matters, and for stuff that matters for people, pretty much everybody's voice has to be heard, unless you're in a kind of totalitarian dictatorship, at which point nobody's voice gets heard. And so I wasn't saying that we should move to that. I was just saying that, to do science, it's you have to filter things so that you're only so that there are lots of wrong ideas and only a few right ideas, and you have to science works and makes progress because you kind of discard the things that don't work and you keep going with the things that are most productive.
We have time for a few more disagreements here. So.
We need to pick up on this a tiny bit, though I'll say that as the policy person on this panel, my immediate reaction to this conversation wasn't our day off the record. That strikes fear into my heart. But part of what this gets at is the tension between climate science as a straight-up scientific enterprise and climate science as something that informs action.
Right.
And
That's what Mike said.
it's science and science for science and science for engineering, for lack of a better distinction. And that doesn't mean that you say one thing is correct for one purpose and another is correct for another purpose. Things that are true. But you do ask different questions, and you have different thresholds for certainty, because knowing something in a big way, in as strong a way as you need to make a scientific statement is different from knowing something in as strong as a way you need to make a policy intervention. On top of that, understanding how people misunderstand science is important if you want to make effective policy interventions. You can't just ignore what they're saying because you think it's wrong. That's an important part of being able to make effective interventions.
I think I'd rephrase that latter statement that you just made. It's important not just to understand how people misunderstand science. What I'd actually say in the context of climate change, it's important to understand how different individuals of different cultures understand the types of risks that climate scientists might point attention to. So it's one thing to say that if emissions of greenhouse gases continue at present rates in the next 30 or 40 years, that the frequency of a particular heat wave in a particular place is going to double. That might be a quite credible scientific statement to make, hedged with a certain amount of uncertainty. How different people are going to interpret that in terms of risk, and therefore in terms of policy intervention or in terms of lifestyle change, is an entirely different set of questions. And if you're going to answer that question, it actually does matter whether people think the sun has moved position on the horizon. Because that is how people, including you and me, that's how we interpret our risks, according to our belief systems. We may not like, or we might disagree with the belief systems that other people hold, but we can't deny the fact that they hold those beliefs. And I think a lot of the additional heat that is generated in public discussions around climate change are because we actually don't like the beliefs that other people hold. And we want those people to hold the same beliefs that we hold. And I think that's where we get into entanglements around climate change and public discourse.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that I think we need to be concerned not just with what climate science is today and knows today, but with what climate science can be and should be in the future. And for that, we really do need to listen to what people are experiencing and thinking and concerned about, and perhaps let their concerns set our agendas.
Just want to repeat something I read in one of Mike Hilm's papers, which is that, you know, we have lots of knowledge about climate change. In fact, we have more knowledge than almost anyone can actually assimilate, and yet our attempts to do something about it are failing. And since you wanted provocative statements, I think the global governance effort has failed, full stop. And I do not think it is going to succeed. I think what is more likely is that we will get some action by some nations, slowly, piecemeal, and reversibly so that things we'll make some advances and then we'll have setbacks. And also that the time for really reducing the risk of climate change is past. It's over. You know, we are in soup. The water is boiling, and we're boiling with it. And I don't think we're going to solve this problem.
I mean, isn't there a continuum of risk? Isn't there a continuum of risk here? How can you say that that time has passed?
The time for avoiding really serious climate change is over. And the reason is, as Gavin will tell you, that there are immense time delays built into the system.
Right.
So even if we stopped emitting all greenhouse gases tomorrow, the planet would still warm for 50 or 100 years, maybe longer.
But I just want to make sure you're not saying that doesn't mean that there isn't time to avoid even worse impacts. Because that sometimes comes through in public discussions. There is this sort of dichotomy. There's this line, and maybe we've crossed it, and maybe we'll cross it in 3 years, which strikes me as a very unconstructive way to think about a problem with, if there are threshold effects, and people debate that kind of thing, we certainly don't know where they are. So, as a matter of risk management, it's worth thinking of this on a continuum.
So let me underline my disagreement with Paul. It's not like there's a soup and we're in it and that's it. We just have to swim with the peas. There is a huge continuum, and so you're right. We're not going to stop global warming, right? That's going to continue for the rest of everybody's life here. None of you are going to see a carbon dioxide level lower than what we have today, on average. But we have enormous choices, and there's never going to be a point. It doesn't matter what happens. There's never going to be a point where there isn't a decision that will make it worse or that will make it better. And and at some point, one has to be optimistic that we will start making decisions to make it not as bad. Now, I think you're right that our ability to avoid all consequences for what we've done up until now and what we're going to continue to do for the next few decades, we're not going to avoid all consequences, and there will be serious disruption. Well, I mean, there's already serious disruption in parts of the world that are the kind of, in an overused phrase, canaries in the coal mine. But you have to think of it as a continuum. There isn't going to be a global threshold. There isn't going to be safe climate. Oh, dangerous climate. Oh, now we're screwed. Right? It's a terrible way of framing it because it breeds fatality and then nihilism. Right? It's like
it's end
there's no
times,
point.
Gavin.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
End times.
Yeah. Unless we're all going to be raptured tomorrow, in which case, none of this is all kind of moot. But you have to think of this as a continuing set of decisions, and we do have choices, which will get more constrained, but we will always have choices.
I'd agree with a lot of that. I think, but we also have choices about how we frame exactly what the problem is that we're trying to attend to. And in a sense, Paul's comment about global governance of the climate system having failed, I would agree with that. So that simply tells us that framing the problem in terms of a multilateral global agreement on reducing carbon emissions using whatever instruments are available, framing the problem in that way has proved not to be a very successful way of framing the problem. But so let's actually think of different ways of framing what the problem might be. We don't have to frame the problem in the way in which we framed it 20 years ago. And I think this is what a number of us have been thinking and writing about recently under the banner of climate pragmatism, partly inspired by the Breakthrough Institute here in the US, is that actually that there's a multitude of problems that actually underlies the risks of climate change. And it might be more tractable if we begin to decompose those into smaller public bads, which can be tackled in a multitude of different ways without relying upon one great, what was it at Copenhagen, the FAB deal?
Fab. Something ambitious and binding.
That's right.
Fair.
Fair, ambitious and binding. You know, that approach clearly failed. So we actually need to think, so for example, climate adaptation, my point about climate adaptation is that that is a public good in its own right. Whether the extreme weather was caused by greenhouse gas emissions or not, or whether it was attributed 80% to greenhouse gas emissions, is not the point. The point is that climate risks are public bads, and we can do something about that. Emissions of black carbon, which is a climate forcing agent, is a public bad. It kills people. But you don't have to bind that up into dealing with transformations of the energy system away from fossil carbon. So there are different ways in which we can structure the problem, and I think the time has come for us to actually think quite radically about different ways of framing what the problem is that we're trying to tackle.
So maybe let me make a few comments. I'm going to resist getting into a discussion about the breakthrough. So let me comment on a couple pieces. I mean, some of this splitting things into separate bits is important. It's still, I think, important to keep in mind how connected some of them are to climate change. I don't think you can have a discussion about 50-year investments and making them climate resilient without having some sense of how much climate change is human caused and how much it isn't, because otherwise, how do you go about thinking about what the world will look like in 50 years? So I mean, the adaptation discussion doesn't get us as far away from climate science as I think a lot of people would like it to get us. The other issue that kind of worries me is that it's not like we have been only having this intellectual discussion about alternatives to the sort of totalizing global agreement for the last 2 years. And this goes back. This goes back to at least 20 years and was done in an intensive way in the years running up to Copenhagen. But it turns out that there's something that doesn't allow that intellectual discussion to translate into the policy and diplomatic world in the way that a lot of us intellectuals who've written about it would like to see happen. Now, maybe we need to do a better job as intellectuals of talking about transitions between different regimes. Political scientists don't really study that in a meaningful way. Or maybe we need to figure out how to do things within the existing approach because it's so path-dependent and so stuck and so symbolic to people that they'll never get away from it. I'm not sure what the answer is to that, but at a minimum, I think we have enough evidence out there to tell us that just coming up with smarter ideas on paper, which several of us up here love to do, doesn't move that global political system. It's paradoxical for those of us who think about international relations because we tend to think of international agreements as soft and flimsy and people can discard them whenever they feel like because they have no binding nature and no teeth. But somehow we can't get away from the thing that so many of us say doesn't work. And that's a puzzle that needs some kind of an answer.
Well, I'm going to provide another thesis that history matters as well as climate matters. And you certainly indicated your passion for the climate studies side. We also had earlier discussions about climate being one of these sort of key words, one of these very large sort of Raymond Williams, contains a lot of meaning, as well as perhaps is meaningful in different ways to different people. is climate an index of meteorological numbers, or is it an agency of our lives and the way we live and go through life in a climate regime? So the question moving forward is, what do you do between now and the apocalypse? So do you become morose and reticent? Do you become hedonistic? That's a nice option there. Does history matter in making those decisions about resilience? Were there other eras, other peoples that were resilient to climate change? And can we learn anything from that? That's part of the purpose of the seminar. And I did hear something about engineering. Could there be some heavy-handed intervention in the climate system that we might call geoengineering? So what's your response? What do we do? What clear message do you have for the public, and how do we go forward into the apocalypse?
Well, one lesson that I've learned from studying the history of climate science is that before the 20th century, ordinary people felt much more vulnerable to changes in climate, to climate variability. They felt their bodies were porous to the environment in ways that we just don't feel anymore. They recorded those experiences in weather diaries. They studied it in sciences like medical geography or bioclimatology. And so I think that, this question of, one of you said, we have a choice. And then the question is, who's we, right? If international agreements aren't working, maybe this really is about changing our bodily awareness of climate and learning to think differently about the relationship between our bodies and the environment and making changes at the individual level.
So you're going to give up your air conditioning so that you can bodily feel climate in a more visceral way?
There's definitely an argument to be made that air conditioning is a major. That air conditioning gets in the way here. Yeah, sure. No, but don't you all experience this? That there's a interplay between what you learn in your academic studies of climate and how you experience the natural environment.
Yeah, and so that's absolutely right. Most of the work that we do, we're understanding climate on an intellectual level, and for most people, most of the time, they don't have enough. They don't want to invest enough intellectual capital in thinking about it most of the time, right? And so then something like Sandy happens, and people suddenly feel vulnerable, right? They suddenly feel a lot more connected to the weather and climate system, and now it turns out that they're far more receptive to talking about climate change, thinking about adaptation, thinking about mitigation, and thinking about where it is personally for them that's going to be involved. And in fact, we saw the same thing after Katrina. I'm sure in Europe after the 2003 heat wave in Moscow in 2010. People's awareness of the issue does change radically once there is some, as you say, like a bodily connection to some kind of event, regardless of what its actual attribution is, because it's got nothing to do with what scientists are saying about that event. It's all about people's suddenly feeling vulnerable to things that people are talking about changing.
That's true. But there are other things also that alter people's perception of risk and danger. So, human beings actually are an amazingly adaptive species. We acclimatize to our surroundings, and you can look at the ways in which. There was a great book by William Mayer, Americans and Their Weather, and showed how during the course of the 19th century the ambient indoor air temperature of American homes increased by about 3 degrees Celsius, unlike European homes that didn't. So what was going on there? That actually Americans were demanding warmer ambient temperatures in their homes, whereas Europeans didn't. So here's an adaptation, if you like, or an inverse adaptation of 3 degrees. My point is that cultures and expectations about living with environmental conditions or environmental risks change over time. They're conditioned by culture, they're conditioned by technology, they're conditioned by science, and in our contemporary world, of course, they're conditioned by our mobility. We actually now experience a multitude of weathers as we travel around the world in ways that our ancestors never did. So I think this whole question about the adaptability of human societies is much more intricate and contingent than we sometimes make it out to be.
I have two things. One is just amplifying on these great points. My son, Luca, is 10, and when he was born, I had recently read an article about a Japanese school where the children wore T-shirts and shorts and went barefoot all year, including in the snow. And there were pictures of them playing happily outside in the snow in this condition. And it really set me thinking. So when Luca began to go outside, we just let him wear whatever he wanted. And we made some efforts to put him in a coat, but he refused. And he is unbelievably hardy to cold weather now, to the point that, when he goes to school, the teachers are constantly trying to make him put clothes on, but if they do that, he overheats. So he wears a T-shirt until, in 40-degree weather, and that's fine with him, and even below that, if you'll let him. So, this is just one kid, but the point is that, the inhabitants of this area and of Canada and all over the northern part of the world in the distant past and even in the present in indigenous cultures lived with very little heat, very little climate control. And what we have built for ourselves, this infrastructure that we live in, you might think of as kind of a giant defense against the climate. We live in a state that, I can't remember who it was, called thermal monotony. Thermal monotony. It's a great phrase. And, one could imagine deliberate efforts to experience more variation in temperature, including indoors. We have a work culture that is related to the infrastructure we live in that demands that we always wear the same clothes, more or less, all year round. That's stupid, right? And yet, if you work in an office building, and especially you work on Wall Street or something, you're going to go dressed like this every single day all year long. So that's one thing. The other thing, now getting back to the history question, one of the things that I've learned from the part of this history that I've studied, which is mostly post-World War II, is that the understanding of climate change and its effects is quite old. It's a lot older than people realize, and really, you can see the beginnings of a building consensus on greenhouse warming in the 1960s. And by the 1970s, you have the Limits to Growth report and various other really alarming studies saying that the path we're on is not sustainable. And those have been repeated and repeated and repeated. They've gotten more refined. But really, the basic heuristic has been there for 50 years. And the response to it has not been, shall we say, jaw-dropping.
So one of the things that history indicates is that we respond not just because we see a problem, but because we see solutions. And I think that's important to keep in the conversation. Climate discussions exist in a bit of their own world. And that's useful for coming up with some ideas and for convincing some people, but I doubt that it gets to the broader set of people and the broader set of decisions that you need. And someone Mike is talking about gets at this, looking at ways of getting at parts of the problem that appeal to people on other bases. But I actually think we ultimately need to think about the fossil energy part of things in a way where it's not just about meeting climate goals, but it's about meeting climate goals at the same time as we meet other economic and political goals that people have. And I don't think that the climate world, for lack of a better term, does a good enough job interacting with the broader energy world and the areas that it affects. And of course, the fault is mutual. One other observation, I think we could ourselves become more exposed to temperature fluctuations and see that. And the reality is that to be motivated for a response to climate change commensurate with the problem, it can't just be about the risks that we see, because some of the largest risks will be and probably the largest risk will be to people who are not in New York City and where tweaking the air conditioning is not the issue that they're dealing with. Tom Schelling has a great way of illustrating this. Say, well, a couple billion people in the world live on less than few dollars a day, put that together, they account for less than a percentage point of GDP to start with. So you cut their income in half and you don't even notice it in your projections. Okay? You need to, if we're going to have I think what's a sort of ethically right response to climate change, that has to still be a big part of the conversation. It can't just be about us seeing things a bit more, even though that's also a critical dimension.
Well, I come from this point of view that there's surprises ahead. I mean, are there just smooth projections of disaster? This came up when they were talking about putting clouds in a climate model, being surprising parameters, maybe ice sheets, putting in a climate model. But it's the human factor, isn't it? We're talking about humans. And it's human resilience and response that might provide some surprises as well as some massive problems. So I want to ask you now, by way of sort of wrapping up the panel discussion, and then we'll open it to the audience. What steps are you taking in your public communication of your concerns, and sort of what's next on your agenda? What's on the horizon here for you?
Sure. I plan on tweeting extensively tomorrow. That's my next public communication step. At least if Gavin said anything nasty about me on Twitter today, I'll tweet in response. So what I'm doing right now is trying to put climate in the context of other objectives that people care about and understand really, what things would be nice from a climate perspective and what are essential, and how does that inform how we look at energy paths that satisfy multiple goals and multiple people and broader sets of people, so that when people decide that there is a problem, they'll have solutions that they are actually interested in pursuing. When I look at the future, I'll say there's one research project that I'm thinking about, and it's related to something I said earlier. I'm interested in transitions in global governance regimes, and I'm interested in particular in the practical question of how do you get out of pathological institutions and into ones that work. Again, because people who study international relations think that pathological institutions are innately self-destroying, they don't ask that question. But they often aren't as self-destroying as people think they are. And it's a really important question to figure out if we want good approaches to global governance on climate.
So one of the things that we're working on quite a lot is expanding the scope of climate models to include more things. Now, partly that's just kind of an intellectual desire to include more things, right? Add in the kitchen sink, add in the furnishing, add in everything. But the more interesting aspect of that is that it suddenly allows us to ask more sophisticated questions about what the consequences of various courses of action would be, that include lots of different effects from one particular action in ways that are actually much more coherent than we've been able to do before. So we include atmospheric chemistry, we include smogs, we include ozone depletion, we include aerosol effects. And so when we say, okay, well, let's try this action here that somebody has tried, but we could make it global. Let's just see what would happen. We can provide more information to policymakers, and you say, well, look, it's going to have this impact on the climate. It's going to have this impact on summer air pollution issues. It's going to have this impact on crops. It's going to have this impact on human health via changes in ozone or other particles that cause asthma and bronchitis and the like. And so instead of the kind of like more standard scientific way of doing things where you just change one thing and you say, look, this has this impact on climate, we're actually now able to talk to policymakers directly, and they say, well, we could do this, what would that do? And we can end up coming up with win-win solutions, the kind of things that you were thinking about and the kind of things that you mentioned earlier, where you can find courses of action that reduce air pollution and improve crop yields and improve the climate outlook, all at the same time with just a few particular actions. So we're working very closely on that in terms of like broadening the scope of things that people can do, but not at the expense of telling people that the big problem is carbon dioxide, right? And you can't get away from that. And if you use those other things that we could be doing, like the black carbon, which is a great thing. We should be reducing black carbon. We should be reducing methane emissions. We should be reducing other precursors. But none of those things are the things that are going to prevent Greenland from melting at a rate that is going to be very, very problematic, right? So, all of the above, but you can't forget about the real reason why people care about what's going to happen with climate. It's not because of black carbon. It's not because of methane, though those are good things to change. It's about carbon dioxide. And, we have to, to not talk about that is to just give up. And I'm not prepared to do that.
Well, I think in the last few years, a lot of my work and also public engagement has been around what I use as the title of my book from a few years ago, Why We Disagree About Climate Change. It actually is to try to help people to understand the many different positions that are taken around this issue of climate change, rather than to assume, which certainly was a lot of the assumption, a lot of my own assumption as well in earlier parts of my career, that simply getting the science straight and getting it communicated well was actually, halfway towards reaching the solution. That is just not the case. There are very legitimate reasons why we disagree about the sort of responses to climate change that are most appropriate. So that's been sort of an underlying theme of my both academic and public work in recent years. And I think the other thing that I'm wanting to do further in the future is to bring back quite a lot of our public conversation about climate change to the weather, to talk about the weather as a way of opening up different types of possibility of both policy and public life. All human cultures have got very rich traditions of understanding and interpreting and living with the weather. And all human individuals have got very particular stories to tell, very personal stories to tell about the weather. And it just seems to me that there's quite a fruitful public conversation that can be created around weather talk, rather than what is now a pejorative discussion around climate change. And that's partly an academic agenda that I want to pursue, but I think it's also a public engagement agenda that I think can turn at least some of the conversation that we've been having in recent years.
Sorry? So I want to say a few things. I'll be as brief as I can. One is that one of the first modelers I interviewed long ago when I started working on my book said, climate models will be politically effective when the grid scales reach the size of a congressional district. That is exactly right, because what people care about is not what's going to happen to the planet, but what's going to happen to me and my family and my tribe and my group around me in the place that I live. So one of the things, like Mike, maybe, I'm not quite sure what he meant by what he said, but I am trying more and more to communicate about this through examples of what really happens to people as the result of extreme weather. So there was a heat wave in Europe in 2003, and 15,000 people died in France, most of them in Paris, where I live now. Talk to Parisians about that heat wave. It's both an example of climate change, and it's an example also of adaptation, because that figure could have been much lower. And they have since figured out ways to make it much lower the next time it happens. Another project I have is to get scientists and everybody else who talks about this issue to stop using the word uncertainty. They're not going to like this because it's such a common word in science, but it doesn't mean the same thing to most people that it does to scientists. To scientists, it refers to a range. We don't know exactly where in this range our answer is going to come out. But it doesn't mean that we don't know anything. But for most people, when you say you're uncertain about something, that means you're unsure. You just don't know. And that isn't the case with this particular issue. The last thing I want to say is that everyone should read Jim Fleming's book about geoengineering called Fixing the Sky. It is a great book and a great read. And this, too, is something I'm beginning to talk about publicly because we're going to hear more and more about this, schemes to try to fix the climate somehow with giant mirrors in space or sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere or something else.
I have to ask, what's the alternative word?
What's the alternative word? Range.
Okay.
Range.
I would have another suggestion, actually. I mean, instead of eliminating the word uncertainty, change the valuation of the word uncertainty. I mean, so this comes out of research for my first book, where liberal scientists in Vienna in the 19th century, during the rise of liberalism, actually prided themselves, kind of sold themselves as the stewards of uncertainty. And I think that this is what we need to recover, that science is good at dealing with situations of uncertainty, right? That's why we should look to science to solve problems where we just don't, we don't know where the world's going, right? But aside from that, to answer Jim's question, how I'm approaching public communication, I'm actually interested in using history to critique our models of public communication, particularly one that comes up a lot in this world, which is public communication as the translation of science into lay terms, right? Translating expert knowledge for the public. I think that works against what we're trying to do. I think instead we need to think about building a common language between the scientists and the public, kind of vernacular science. This is what I see working well in the 19th century. It was a different world. It was a much less democratic world. There were it was a small section of the population that was engaged in this kind of vernacular science. But it's coming back today. I mean, the citizen science movement, I think, has a lot of potential to offer us other models for public communication.
Well, we're at the end of the first session of the section of the session. So let's thank our panelists for their insights so far. And now we have the luxury of time of having you asking really outrageous questions that get them revved up again. And do we have a microphone for the... So please, I guess, could you, or somebody, please go to the microphone because we're trying to capture this event on video. So if you'd ask your question over here, you could just come over. I see two people coming, and be provocative.
Yeah, hi. Hello. My name is Vivek, and my background is in physics too. And now I do modeling of derivatives and move to capital markets. So, just as an ex-physicist or an ex-scientist, my questions are, unfortunately, a little bit more technical and geeky. And so the questions are, what is the rigor of the mathematical models you're using? Assuming they're like Navier-Stokes kind of equations, right? And since the atmospheric system is a highly nonlinear, complex system, with what certainty or confidence can you make serious claims which are affecting profoundly, the evolution or future of the entire mankind on Earth, right? So there are all these different variables and like unsolved problems like turbulence, cosmic ray effects on cloud formation, right? UV effect on jet streams, and perhaps fundamentally, and I'm not in this field, full time. So the question is, the solar radiance, an effect on the first significant digits and the second significant digits. Yes, CO2 has an influence, but if you look at all the hockey stick diagrams and the fact that, at least from what I hear, that CO2 and the temperature dependence is not linear, and all the temperature predictions that we have right now are falling below the predictions of all the 70 or 80 mathematical models that are in place. So, from what I hear, next 5 to 6 years,
because there's a lot of stuff there, and I don't want to miss anything. So
Keep it pithy, then.
I shall try and keep it pithy. So, yes, the system is very complex. Yes, the models are imperfect. But there are tests that you can do to see whether they're useful, right? So we can look at natural experiments that have happened either within the instrumental period, like so big volcanoes have gone off. Like so Mount Pinatubo went off in 1991, put up a huge shield of small sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere, cooled the planet for about 2 years. And lots of other things happened. There were changes in radiation, there were changes in rainfall, there were changes in the wind patterns, and we can see whether the models produce those same things given that same input. And for a large part, they do. We can look at whether those same models, which are tuned for today's climate, they're trying to do their best, also do the same, do a good job when you go back to the last ice age. We can take those models kind of out of the box and say, hey, this weird thing happened 8,000 years ago where we think this lake collapsed and it affected the ocean circulation. Well, let's put in a lake collapse in the model and let's see whether it gives us the same patterns that we see in the ice core records or in the cave records or whatever. And these models do a pretty good job on that. They're not perfect, but there are out-of-sample cases where we can test whether what we've created actually has skill. It actually gives you more information than you would have just guessed from the input. And so they are useful, right? And they are skillful. Now, you mentioned, solar changes. Okay, so yeah, I mean, the sun changes. We can measure that. We've been measuring that for 30 years from satellites. We're measuring the changes in the UV. We're measuring the changes in the total solar irradiance. And we can see the impact of that, particularly in the stratosphere. We can see ozone changing on that 11-year timescale. We can see temperatures changing. We can see the circulation changing. It's small compared to what you're seeing because of the carbon dioxide. I mean, that's just... the changes that we've made in carbon dioxide, it's gone from 280 to 400, right? That's over a 30% change. Carbon dioxide is responsible for about 20% of the greenhouse effect that keeps the planet warmer than a snowball. It's not a small thing that we're messing with. Is that 50 enough?
Anybody else want to address this issue? Then we have a second.
Thank you. I remember vividly the first Earth Day back in 1969. And many of the issues that were discussed about fossil fuels, those issues were sort of accepted by a certain percentage of the population. And what we've seen for the past 50 years, and here we talk about politics, power, and policy, we've seen the energy industry aggressively take action to prevent public understanding about this. In fact, attack it aggressively. And that's what's been going on, as we all know, for the past 50 years. So how do you, as a panel, understand how to combat that? Because a lot of Americans have confusion about that. I myself tried to interview Mr. Hansen when the Bush II administration prevented him from being interviewed. And if one recalls, someone out there in policy land decided to take off the websites of the government all the studies that had been there before about coastal erosion from the sea rising. Okay? I remember that very vividly because I was covering it as a journalist. So how do you see this issue, and particularly the power of the oil industry, basically trying to obfuscate this issue for everybody in the world to understand?
Absolutely right. And it's a huge and powerful force. I mean, it's a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure that is not going to go down overnight because people decide that it's not a good idea. And yes, there's been a long and concerted and very deliberate campaign, well-funded by the energy industry and by conservative think tanks that aren't necessarily allies of energy, but interests, but of free markets. What can we do? We kind of speak truth to power. You have to kind of keep bringing up the issue and point this out and draw the lines where you can between the money and what gets said. That's my answer.
And Mike
So let me
Levy,
build
you're
on
an
that.
energy analyst, and then we'll have Mike Hume give us a perspective from across the pond.
I mean, there still is some of that. I think there's less of that than there was in the past. And I think it's important to keep in mind that even if you... So that's an essential piece, but it's important to keep in mind that even if everyone woke up magically tomorrow and decided climate change was a problem, that doesn't necessarily mean we would deal with it. I mean, last I checked, most people in the United States think that unemployment is too high. But we seem to have disagreements over economic policy. So this idea that if we all just knew the facts everything would happen nicely, I don't think lines up with reality. The other piece I would emphasize is this is tricky territory. There are plenty of ways to pursue action on climate as part of a broader package that benefit parts of the fossil fuel industry. For example, natural gas producers would benefit if we put a price on carbon tomorrow. It's important to keep those sorts of things in the conversation rather than drawing an overly hard line on the who's on the side of the angels and who is not.
This might be a very good task for the historians here. You know, I mean, the anti-science rhetoric that emanates from various quarters, it's not unique to this issue, right? It was very similar in response to concerns about ozone depletion. It was very similar in response to acid rain. Some of the same exact people were writing the same exact op-ed with just like, you know, one or two things changed for the Wall Street Journal, you know, 40 years ago about those topics that are now doing the same thing against climate change, right? So as a matter of public discourse, it's actually a very old tactic. And I'm sure that, you know, I'm thinking back 40. Well, I'm looking back 40 years. I'm sure you could look back, you know, even further, where similar kinds of rhetoric were used, and it would be very interesting to see whether these things just faded away when something became less politically salient, or whether, you know, people, you know, combated them like kind of, you know, on the battlefield of ideas, and they were defeated, or it just went away, or they won, or, you know, what actually happened there. I think that would be a very interesting aspect, because you mentioned Steve Schneider earlier on. So he wrote a great book called Science as a Contact Sport, which was basically his autobiography of his career in science, and then basically his career in the public eye. And you know, I knew him in the later years of his life. I didn't know him when he was here at my institutes back in the early 1970s, and he was fired by the director because he wrote a letter to the New York Times without telling the director. And it was a letter to the New York Times, you know, criticizing one of these kind of standard denier op-eds associated with just like standard air pollution issues, and he was fired, and you know, eventually somebody got him. They persuaded the director to reinstate him, but anyway, he left and went to NCAR. But I couldn't help thinking, that I was reading this book, how similar everything was to what my own path through public communications has been. I mean, nobody has fired me, but all of the same things that happened to him, you know, the threats, the misinterpretations, the misquotes, the you know, the forces of disinformation, all of those things were very, very familiar. And I was just looking at it and saying, okay, well, you know, is this history repeating itself the second time, hopefully as fast? Or is it just like the same thing over and over and over and over and over again? And I think that there's a lot to be learnt, perhaps, from a slightly deeper study of that.
Well, I think one lesson that we can draw from the past record is that, yes, it's very similar, but it's also gotten a lot more sophisticated, and it has become a standard and well-understood strategy on the part of think tanks and individuals too, and so that we see it repeated, you know, through many, many issues, and it is very, very corrosive because it attacks not only, you know, this particular issue, but the whole idea of science.
No, I mean, it's corrosive because it's very personal. I mean, like, the whole thing is kind of based on a shoot the messenger strategy, where I'm the messenger, and that really people are trying to shoot at you. Yeah. And I mean, not literally, thankfully, but it's very personal, and by that it's very corrosive because, like, you know, scientists who just do their science, you know, you don't expect that kind of thing when it arrives.
Well, one of the things that's going on right now is that, of course, especially in the last decade, we've seen a massive change in the ability of individuals and groups to publish books, articles, web pages, blogs, etc., without any kind of peer filter. So Riley Dunlap just published an article about 108 denialist books about climate change that have been published in the last 20 years, of which about half in the last decade, many of them directly funded by conservative think tanks, but an increasing number self-published by individuals with no apparent connection to anything. And the thing is that they're now able to do this. These books look like ordinary, legitimate books that have been through a kind of editorial process, but they're not. And it is becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish between expert knowledge and knowledge that is produced by this kind of counter-expertise industry.
Yeah, I think it's important here to distinguish between two kinds of denial. One is this fabrication of doubt, right? And I'm referring to Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's book on this problem, Merchants of Doubt. But I think we need to distinguish that from a more pervasive and maybe even insidious form of denial, which is really psychological. Some psychoanalysts have been making this argument recently, and I find it compelling that there's a really important psychological dimension to climate denial in that it causes us the sense that we have destroyed our own environment, our own supportive environment, causes us such anxiety that it can be very hard to deal with on our own. And there are actually analysts who have started organizing support groups, carbon conversations, right? So that communities can get together and support each other as they think about how to change their lifestyles to reduce their carbon impact. And I think there's something to this. I think that we really do need some support to deal with this really existential anxiety that awareness of global warming can cause us.
So I want to be very careful in what I'm about to say to not diminish the fact that there is plenty of disinformation out there, and it has often been pursued for very base reasons of different groups trying to protect their economic interests. This is not just a one-sided thing. So one of the big fights I've got drawn into a lot in the last couple of years is the fight over natural gas development in the United States. There is plenty of nonsense passing as science from opponents of natural gas development. Now, there are plenty of challenges and problems with shale gas development. There are plenty of things we need to do to make it safer, but there's also plenty of nonsense out there. There's plenty of papers that look like they're nice papers, but that are actually junk produced by think tanks in a different part of the political spectrum. There are plenty of papers that have made it through 2 peer reviewers that are very bad and that won't stand the test of time, but that get trotted out by advocates of a particular political position over and over and over. When the New York Times ran a peculiar series of articles a couple years ago about fracking and never consulted any independent experts, when the ombudsperson went to the editors and asked, why didn't you do that? They said, there are no independent experts. There are only people from industry and people who think there's a problem here. That's not a healthy situation. So I think to fully understand the phenomenon, it's useful to take a step back and acknowledge, without practicing some sort of equivalence, reflexive equivalence, that this is something where people take the opportunity to use whatever scientific view they like, that it extends beyond one part of the political world.
I'm sorry. I'm going to ask Mike Hume to give us a view from England.
Yeah, I think it looks, the original question doesn't look quite the same from where I live and from the nature of climate politics in the UK. I mean, at one level, okay, there are interests, but that is politics. There are powerful interests, there are slightly less powerful interests, and there are people who are powerless. And that is the nature of all societies. and that is the nature of all politics, is how different interests promote themselves and how they get challenged by other interests. And I think, picking up on Michael's point, one of the most unhelpful things around climate change, as I see it from the UK, is this desire to perpetuate a simple binary, that there are scientists who think that humans cause global warming, and then there are scientists who don't. And I mean, there was a classic paper by William Anderegg a few years ago that simply divided scientists into two categories, as though those are the only two positions that scientists can take on climate science. It's crazy. And we see the same thing around climate politics. Either you're for a cap and trade system or you're not. Or you're for a targets and timetables approach or you're not. And we need to get away from this simplification, this binarization. Many of the really vibrant questions are, what sort of energy systems do we actually want our society to develop? Do we want wind turbines? And this is one of the most lively political discussions in the UK. And that does not reduce to a simple binary. Certainly not with the usual suspects, anyway, about whether you want wind turbines or not. So the whole thing about climate change, it's a multifaceted phenomenon, and it requires a much more sophisticated politics. And I think I sometimes get very frustrated with some climate scientists who almost want to perpetuate this binarization that we're in this camp, and if you're not in this camp, then you clearly are in the only other camp that possibly can exist.
Pick up very briefly on one of Mike's comments. I think it's really important to emphasize this division between what you believe about science and what you believe about risks and what you believe about policy is very important. I've been in meetings where I've said, I don't think that a global agreement with targets and timetables will work. I think we need something else. And I will get back from people, how come you don't think climate change is a problem? Now, I think we need something else precisely because I do think climate change is a problem and the global targets and timetables approach isn't working. But people, and these are smart people and sophisticated people, have these connections so hardwired that it's often they don't even realize that when they're hearing a policy position, they're inferring a position on science and risk.
And we have one final question. Two. I'm sorry, I didn't see you in line. We have two final questions. Now we have three. Well, we're getting time constraints, so keep it short.
I guess I'm interested really in the, Michael, you mentioned this term that I've never really heard before called pathological institutions, and you suggested we should get rid of them. And I'm just, number one, wondering what you meant by pathological institutions. That sounds really kind of nasty, and we should obviously get rid of them. But number two, I'm wondering if you mean the institutions that kind of provide the infrastructure of how we live our lives institutionally, whether that be the institution of democracy or the institution of Washington, D.C., or I'm not sure what you meant.
Sure.
My second question would be, what can citizens do to understand what their role is in developing a new set of institutions that hopefully aren't as pathological as you suggest we currently are in?
So I'm thinking about international institutions. The reason, well, there are many reasons. I'm sure you haven't heard it. One is because I think I might have made it up. I like the term. To me, a pathological institution is an institution that does not do what it's supposed to do, but that continues to exist nonetheless. So in the camp of people who think about international relations, who think that institutions aren't as sort of in the world, international institutions aren't nearly as hard and binding globally as they are domestically because there's no police behind it and all that. One of the functions they think international institutions serves is to help people process information and to understand the situation. So instead of an individual person reading a 800-page report about the Iranian nuclear program, they go and see whether the International Atomic Energy Agency has given it a seal of approval. And so that institution helps with information and therefore helps us function as an international society. I'll give you an example in the climate space of what might be a pathological institution. To the extent that there's a belief around the world that compliance with the Kyoto Protocol equals success and seriousness on climate change, if that's not actually true, then the Kyoto Protocol has a pathology as an institution that causes problems by prompting people to not pay attention to deficiencies in how we're acting. If people believe that an International Atomic Energy Agency inspection of a country means that there's no risk that they'll develop nuclear weapons, when that's not true, that has become in some ways an institution with pathologies. Now again, the reason I brought it up is because most people in the international relations world assume that those will be self-correcting because international institutions are so plastic. And they just don't seem to be. They seem to be very sticky. So that's what I mean pathological institutions, institutions that, at least that's one dimension, institutions that lead us to believe things that we should not believe because of how they're translating information. How can we change that? I'm not sure. And I think it's a tough question to ask. One candidate hypothesis would be they get changed when big, powerful players decide they want to change them. And right now, big, powerful players don't want to because they're quite convenient to them. And I mean powerful countries. Another may be that it really is about changing the ideas that negotiators and participants have. I'm skeptical of that, but that's one idea, and I think you can find some scenarios where that happens. And the third might be it has to, requires a fundamental break in the world. You got rid of the League of Nations because of World War II. So they're different candidate theories. I'm not sure which one works.
Hi there. My question is slightly more practical. What do your models say or predict or imply that the revolution in hydraulic drilling and fracturing will have on carbon emissions and on energy pricing?
So climate-wise, there are two issues, right? One is that in producing useful energy, natural gas has about half the emissions of coal-sourced energy. That's a good thing. The other thing that goes into the mix is how much fugitive emissions there are. So these are emissions of methane that come out because of the drilling process, the transport process, leaks in pipelines, in transport, and things like that. Now, the fugitive emissions don't need to be very large before they cancel out the advantage that natural gas has over coal. Now, the problem is, and that's because methane is a greenhouse gas that is shorter lived but more powerful for various radiative reasons. The problem is that nobody knows what that number is. People are not monitoring it. People are not paying much attention to it, despite the fact that this is an industry that's designed to capture gas and sell it to people. They are remarkably cavalier about how much they capture. Now, the reason why they're cavalier is because even though capturing it and being a little bit more careful about what they do would save them money, so the investment in making sure it was leak-free would more than repay itself by selling the gas that they lose. It turns out that the rate of return on investment in those kinds of strategies is much less than the rate of return of investment in new fields. So if they have a certain amount of capital, it's still better for them to drill something new and not worry about the leaks because they're just making money hand over fist from the shale gas. So, okay, I guess I'm being cut off. No. So those are those two things, and right now, I mean, maybe you'll concur, but nobody knows what those numbers are, and we're not putting in place enough monitoring for the anecdotal information that we're getting in based on, ozone exceedances that come about because, methane is an ozone precursor. So you're having in Wyoming, you're having a lot of air pollution issues suddenly out of nowhere. Why is that? Well, it's because they're downwind of leaking methane issues. So whether in the end they'll reduce that, or whether they can demonstrate that it's not a problem, that will determine whether this is a good thing for climate or not.
I don't know.
Don't know.
So I would also divide it into two things, but in a different way. I don't want to get deep into the methane debate. It's the thing that after a dozen years out of the physics world pulled me back into writing for peer-reviewed journals, which isn't a pleasant thing in my world. I find it really frustrating. I think it's very hard to push the numbers up high enough that it actually becomes worse for climate change than coal. In part because if you're looking at actual stabilization scenarios, gas phases out well before you end up with your peak temperature. So at least if you're focusing on the impact on peak temperatures, methane is potent on short time scales and not as potent on longer time scales. The signal largely, not entirely by any stretch, largely dies away by the time you might have an impact on peak temperatures. I think that it's important to understand better how much methane is leaking, in part because even if it's not as big a climate problem as some people have made it out to be, the associated local pollutants are a large problem, and we should improve that. The other thing I'd say is I think the emerging on-the-ground work suggests that to the extent that there is a substantial methane problem, it's not a fracking problem, it's a distribution system problem. If you had the kinds of leaks that some people have suggested at actual wells, you would be seeing fatalities from explosions with that kind of concentrated leakage. Local distribution systems, much easier to have distributed leaks that cause problems, and I think that those serious on-the-ground work is pointing at those sorts of places. But to me, the two issues are this sort of how good or bad is gas versus coal, and that's the first one. The second is what does a shift to gas do to transformation of the overall energy system? I mean, to me, that's the big second question. Does this help us get toward zero carbon energy on a timescale we'd like to be, or does it hurt our efforts to do that? I argue in a book that's out about a month ago that we can use it in a way that helps us get where we want to be more effectively. But it's about choices. And I think that's the other important point to drive home. By itself, the development of cheap natural gas is not going to have a radical impact on our emissions. You saw gas climb to as big of a share of electricity as coal last year on the basis of unsustainably low prices. Its share has fallen by almost half in the last 6 months. So gas gives us a less expensive option than we had before with which we can reduce emissions. But it's an option, and you then have to choose to use it to reduce emissions. That's a policy question.
Thank you.
Hi. So I just wanted to end on a more positive note, I guess, in terms of, we talk about how we're already in the soup, but how we can't really just frame it in that. We have to frame it in terms of solutions. So I was wondering if you all could offer maybe some specific, very quickly, some specific maybe local or national political and economic models that have seemed to have been more successful in addressing the challenge of climate change.
Actually, those exist. The best models are a number of small Scandinavian cities that have either actually achieved or planning to achieve in the next 10 years carbon neutrality, and they're really doing it. Now they have cultural and infrastructure advantages that many places don't have, so it's not a model that can always be replicated. But looking at cities that have made really serious efforts is to me, the most inspiring place to look.
Any other?
Just a rather similar answer. In the UK, there's a new social movement called the Transition Towns Movement, which has drawn together a narrative drawing upon climate change, climate risks, peak oil, and the desirability of a more localized social economy. So it's not specifically playing the climate change card on its own, but what it's doing is actually creating a narrative for innovating new forms of local social and economic and environmental sustainability. It's a relatively small movement, it's not dramatic, but I think is a way of offering different ways, in the UK at least, of thinking about human responsibility for living collectively and for living well, then I think it's an interesting example to have a look at.
Good. So I'm inviting you all to Maine. Colby just became carbon neutral, and we'll come up when it's about 30 below, and we'll see how resilient we are. There are trained climate counselors in the room. Just I wanted to announce that. And in the course of this conversation, we started out with a kind of a divergent giant field of climate and global governance. So I think we arrived closer to a we, an understanding that we have a lot to learn from each other. We have the privilege of having a fantastic panel, so I'd say give them another appreciation. And we have a great opportunity to learn about how climate matters, how history matters, how enlightened public policy matters. And I think we've all have a common denominator that we're really passionate about these issues, and everybody here came because they're passionate as well. We're verging on hedonistic, but we're not completely there yet. But we're not morose. We are, I think, we have resilience that we haven't even tried to evoke yet from our inner being. And Paul's example of his 10-year-old is an inspiring one. We're not into simple fixes. We're into vexing simple fixes and then going on to a higher sort of solution space. And I think we are into sort of targeted proactive actions, nuanced rather than this partial polarization. Should we continue that, or should we go for something a little more on the high ground? So I'm really inspired that, and in a way passionate about this conversation, and I'm looking forward to continuing it through Hertog. Again, thanking Hertog for what they've done to bring us together, all of us together. I have a practical announcement that the handouts you got, and if you sign up, you'll get more emails and things, and you'll be informed of future public programs. There's one next week on the Thursday, the 13th, John Topping from the Climate Institute in Washington, D.C., and there's Wally Broker's coming up from the Columbia system, and there's a number of very prominent people on this list, ending up with Bill McKibben in August. I think it's August 2nd. So you're invited back, and please seek out your designated climate counselor. And thank you very much for your attention.